She is Kelly is the lead editor of American Speech among the New Words Quarterly Dictionary, the co-host of, and you get to actually hear Kelly in Night Shift, where life is like science fiction on WBAI. She's the incoming convener of the North American Research Network in Historical Sociolinguistics. So the American Dialect Society New Words Committee, she's the data czar. Get that email. Okay, what's the word of the year, folks? Let's go. So very active scholar, a sociolinguist, an activist, a social activist who's looking both at linguistics, sociolinguistics from a metalinguistic perspective, and really as an experimental sociolinguistics and sociophonetics. I celebrate the fact that she has the best paper in language in 2024, Housing Policy and Linguistic Profiling, an audit study of 3 American dialects. And I encourage everyone here to really take the time to go through it and read it. It is a paper about justice, and she invites us to think about language and justice. Her other publications are co-authored around among the New Words American Speech, as well as a single authored paper, Bias in Automatic Speech Recognition, the Case of African American English. So just a scholar who is committed to producing and publishing and to really bring the public into these spaces, important spaces of the work that we do. So welcome. We look forward to hearing you talk about the Black Accented Standard, a story of maintenance. We're so happy to have you.
Oh my gosh, you were right. I am about to cry. Thank you. Thank you, Renee. Thank you everyone for having me. I'm so happy to be here today. Sorry. No, thank you. Okay, so I thank you for that wonderful introduction. I like to start all of my talks with a positionality statement. So I will say, hello, I am Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. I'm a Black biracial cisgender woman from Appalachia, and I identify as a member of the queer community. And I am an assistant professor in language sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. To begin, today's talk is available at this QR code, and as always, my slides include a full transcript of what I'll share today in lieu of signed interpretation for this event, or for those who just prefer to follow along. I have also embedded these slides with links throughout to other talks and papers, so if you want to engage deeper on some of today's topics, you'll have resources right there. Verticalization and standard language ideologies walk hand in hand. The data I've collected illustrates this, although it wasn't designed to do so. It was designed to provide an immediate means for centering the Black community in the study of their own linguistic variation, both over time and in real time. What we'll be discussing today is an emergent pattern I've observed from metalinguistic interview data I collected in 2022, which I find elaborative of developing historical sociolinguistic theory. But let's begin with a couple basics. First, I am an experimental sociolinguist conducting policy-driven research from a large-scale, top-down, historically informed stance. I do this because what is most interesting to me about language change is how the social history of the world essentially selects for us a pool of language to interact with. We'll unpack how that functions in a moment, but I'd just like to underscore first that from my perspective as a researcher, linguistic discrimination is a natural phenomenon which amplifies systemic oppression. Just an overarching point to keep in mind that might be useful. Also, I want to share that I use the term AAL, or African American languages, joining the authors pictured here in taking a top-down, historically informed approach to categorization. AAL is not only used in the United States, it is not only used by Black people. AAL represents a full spectrum of varieties that its community of users orients to, and not only on the vernacular end or informal end of the spectrum. These languages are united by a shared social history, a history bookended by enslavement and settler colonialism. When Africans were shipped as cargo to this continent, a continent already ravaged by extractive imperialism, they were organized into groups that could not communicate, that had no shared language among them. This was a forcible and purposeful erasure of connections to culture and identity, a bleaching, a sanitizing of this cargo, these tools for immediate installation in the fields and mines of the New World. These acts of linguistic separation are a standard of practice which reaches back to ancient Egypt, who systematically removed prisoners' connection to their mother tongues and cultures to ensure compliance and to create over several generations a blank canvas upon which to paint their own national ideals. All right. Embodiment. Language issues from living sources. The body's involvement in the creation and perception of language is indisputable. Even modalities which may be long removed from the human who created them presuppose another human's presence when we interact with them. These outlined hands represent the oldest recorded example of human social communication. Different scientists take many different things from this artifact. For the linguist, it is a moment preserved, uncovered in the depth of time that depicts the human ability to externalize thoughts through the body for consumption by an audience with a shared knowledge base. That's a lot of assumptions, but what we can glean from this first preserved text is that this was not creativity for creativity's sake. It was communication. These symbols and others like them were employed for the purpose of marking place, establishing ownership, documenting lifeways, and conducting ritual. Each aspect of knowledge we retrieve from studying these most ancient of texts allows us to understand something very basic about the ways in which all language necessarily operates through the body and situates the user within a given social role as one member of a larger landscape of kin and creature. When we start to look back over approximately 200,000 years of human languaging and consider the types of language people deem to be proper, or believe sound pleasing to the ear, or have determined more appropriate than other types of language for certain venues or forms of address, none of that falls out of the natural evolution of linguistic systems. Those realities are products of who has been in social control over time. Across time and across communities, the ways in which most people have had open to them to use language in the world has not been entirely free. This is merely an observation of environmental constraints on embodied usage. These constraints are incredibly old. They are older than every living human being. They are older than the printing press. And these engines, which turn what Silverstein referred to as the irreducible dialectic of linguistic production and perception, are one force which has been shaping language variation and change since the beginning. Because queer, high yellow, and woman existed before I did. Because the expectations that teach others how to clock me are also the same ones which teach me how to be seen. The material and social history of the world has a significant influence over the functional operation of our individual linguistic systems, and every single one of us labors to construct and conduct self under this influence. Bourdieu describes the linguistic market, the now containing space, where the dialectic moment of social process occurs, as a structure which imposes itself through a system of specific sanctions and censorships. Those sanctions and censorships relate directly to the development of a standard of production, an established norm which serves as an exchange rate in the market, in essentially any context where language is being used. The closer produced language is to the standard, to the established exchange rate, the more market value it contains. Such a valuing is made possible because the usage of linguistic material carries different social meanings which become active when certain conditions are met. For example, material like the fortified D in day, which is sometimes racialized and other times regionalized, or usage of a variety like Yiddish, which can variously indicate one's ethnicity, religion, or region of origin. Social meanings manifest because every individual anticipates language issuing from another living source, another body. Project this reality across millennia of language use, and we come to find that the material and individual moves as a thinker, both as a perceiver and producer of language, becomes conditioned by their social milieu. Our linguistic norms of production that set the exchange rate in our markets extend far beyond the form and function of the linguistic variables we produce and create space for certain linguistic material to be valued differently depending on who is producing it. The listener, real or idealized, is empowered in the linguistic market because meaning is processed inside the perceiver. The seat of power inside the listening subject makes the whole person available for identity performance and identity erasure. Okay, quick review. What is imposing itself? The material and social history of the world. These are the extant domains of usage and their construction. How are specific sanctions developed? Passively and actively by those in social control over time. This is how one way of languaging is chosen as preferred. What is style? A material representation of the ways in which an individual user perceptually navigates the universal constraints which apply to all users. This is how one orients to preference. Commodified sociolinguistic labor takes place in the linguistic market. Sociolinguistic labor is defined by Holiday and Squires as the physical, emotional, and psychological effort put into deploying sociolinguistic resources in a way that is meant to satisfy others. We can use this concept to understand Bourdieu's formulation of the linguistic market from the perspective of the individual language user, rather than that of sanctions and censorship. All people engage in sociolinguistic labor. For example, we may choose not to use certain words like profanity because our parents or elders prefer us not to, even though we'd be perfectly comfortable using those terms with interlocutors our own age or even in our writing. We do the sociolinguistic labor of self-censorship when we are around our elders or authority figures to satisfy them, to make them comfortable, to show them respect, to keep ourselves out of trouble. We choose linguistic variables or styles based on what we anticipate the listener wants, knows, or prefers, a choice heavily informed by that listener's class, age, race, gender, sexuality, regionality, ability, and so on. Sociolinguistic resources have utility because they, like all material, possess specific properties that make them appropriate to meet certain needs. Like all forms of labor, sociolinguistic labor has the power to produce more value than it contains. This outcome results in part from the development of a globalized economy that values homogeneity. This is exemplified in Zhang's 2005 study of Beijing professionals, which richly engages with the socio-historical facts of recent Chinese history that led to the development of ideologies which differently index locality and standardness, or more specifically, state mandate following, and help illustrate that participation in such markets is, quote, not completely a matter of personal choice, end quote. As users with bodies, seated in particular moments in time, we have linguistic material at our disposal that has its own social history, its own life in the culture and meaning that is both relative to our bodies and independent from them. Zhang reports urban professionals and transnational enterprises are producing more standard or unaccented varieties because failure or inability to use them would be detrimental to one's image as a competent professional. These individuals do not move away from locally indexed styles because they eschew Beijing identity. They do so because in their professions, those styles are undervalued and or stigmatized. I would like to recast sociolinguistic labor today as a result of simultaneous and individually manifest idiolectal development. As users, we are sensitive to expectations arising from the domain or market we find ourselves in. Each linguistic variable we produce, and in turn, the linguistic styles we develop both as individuals and communities over time, emerges in response to the significance of social information, social categories, and social ideologies, which derive from our social milieu. Our social milieu asks very little of some users in terms of their variable linguistic production because what is already natural or comfortable for them is what is expected across most linguistic markets, what has become so-called appropriate in most domains of usage. As our social milieu encourages production aligned with standardized varieties, individuals with inappropriate bodies, cities, jobs, and genders are called to engage in additional sociolinguistic labor to exist in the status quo while maintaining their individuality. Such additional labor is visible at all levels of linguistic production, from national to cognitive, and has resulted in a reduction in linguistic variation over time, beginning in the late Middle Ages and coinciding with the rise of agrarian capitalism. This reduction has created an imbalance which permeates all linguistic data sets, as it is primarily the linguistic production of those in power, which established forms and categories, was most likely to be invariably produced across registers and regions, which was physically preserved over time, and which remains defaulted in our collective linguistic imagination. Allow me to provide some key examples. Verticalization is the process through which individuals orient to the larger society outside of their immediate community and thus begin incorporating the language of that larger society into their daily practice. Language shift follows the adoption of more vertical linguistic practices. Nader connects that shift to the notion of modernity itself, reinforcing Warren's point that a user or community is more likely to give up local control of lifeways in favor of assimilating to increasingly interdependent institutions as those institutions become more industrialized and globalized. Susan Gall's foundational study of Oberwart lays out the ways in which these three phenomena, standardization, verticalization, and institutionalization, connect in a modern linguistic community in transition. Gall describes the ways in which a previously Hungarian community, that's it highlighted there on the map, they also have a really famous mall. This Hungarian community, 50 years after becoming Austrian at the end of World War I, was urbanized, and through that process began a transition towards German monolingualism. I won't reiterate the entire paper for you, although if you haven't had a chance to read it, it does hold up better than some other foundational texts in our field. But what's key in this conversation is the seemingly binary choice the youngest users have. Stop speaking Hungarian to join the modern world or be left in the past with no personal or professional prospect. Why are people motivated to use one style over another? Why do we see standardized language gradually replacing all other ways of languaging across all spheres of usage? Well, in Gall's study, which centers on personal choice, it can be rather easy to neglect that in an industrial society, no community can be self-sufficient. Peasant men can't get wives because the Oberwart women have been called to the city by the twin siren songs of security and prosperity, tunes which set up a strong internal resistance to using Hungarian, the only language capable of enacting their cultural heritage. This is not a new phenomenon, the glamour of standardization, although perhaps a more passive one than history often records. For example, when Charlemagne attempted to create an empire-wide cure for variation by developing a so-called invariable script, or when the Old English were obliterated by the Normans in 1066 and the Old English language along with them, they lost whole modalities of production in a generation. Instead of resisting, working to maintain Old English against rapid shift, the language and its users took a kind of like suck-uppy journey to Middle English, absorbing Norman words, word parts, and sounds along the way, which increased a user's proximity to the standard, as well as their access to institutions new and old. We see a similar process operating on the national scale in 1950s Ghana, during which the first African move against colonial rule, which sought to create a new Africa for African people, could only conduct nation building under the umbrella of colonial English, despite the vast linguistic diversity that Ghana's borders held. Her leaders had a seemingly binary choice: elevate a Ghanaian language to national prestige or elevate Ghana to global prestige. Over a decade after my fieldwork in Ghana, I remain unable to shake a profound sadness at the thought that this choice, A necessity for bringing further institutionalization and participation in a globalized economy essentially verticalized the nation overnight, relegating generations of Ghanaians to a scenario where their languages all but disappeared from their physical lives, where robust mother tongues, some older than civilization itself, became stifled and maligned in favor of progress. In this light, we can come to understand why Fishman argues that habitual language choice is far from a random matter of momentary inclination. Even if we may be monolingual, or we feel that our language doesn't shift much, what is being weighted, the value for variables for a user, a variable's exchange rate in the emergent context, is to an extent predetermined by the structure of the market and what it anticipates as a norm of production. Such realities have a significant influence over the ways in which whole groups choose to use language. And as Giles tells us, this system of specific sanctions and censorships which govern the now-containing space really shape a group's ability to survive and thrive as a distinct and collective active entity. While this may be already clear, from considering Obervart wives and Ghanaian nationalists today, or even with your own engagement with revitalizationist literature in the past, I'd like to provide one more example of the ways in which such constraints play out over time by looking briefly at African American history before turning to my original research on Black professionalism. In 1705, the institution of slavery is officially codified in what would later become the United States. And although enslaved Africans have been laboring against their will on this continent since around 1501, the document written in 1705 was created for a specific purpose, and that was to shore up confusions created since 1619 in mercantile standards. Slavery was an industry, one that had all but supplanted the tradition of indentured servitude. Until this point, people of all colors and nationalities traded their labor for a certain period of time, usually between 4 and 7 years, to come to the New World. This document in 1705 creates two racial classes of people from what was once a homogeneous indentured servant class already present on the continent. The white indentured servants, upon completion of their contract, are effectively given the means to begin generating wealth. 10 bushels, 30 shillings, and a gun, if they were a man. Now, to translate that into something meaningful, 10 bushels is a lot. That's about 600 pounds of grain. 1 acre of wheat is enough to feed a family for 2 years. So that is more than enough to not only keep a whole family alive, but also for them to start a business, to become self-sustaining. And 30 shillings is about $150, which was then enough to survive on for about a year. Black people, on the other hand, are transferred immediately into enslavement, making their servitude contracts null and void. The 1705 document also outlines, as many mercantile contracts do with live cargo, how owners are allowed to punish those that step out of line, effectively dehumanizing the Black population and removing any immorality or possibility of censure for the killing of Black people by those who now possess them. The 1739 Negro Act made it illegal to teach enslaved Blacks how to read and made literacy in Black literacy punishable by torture and death. The United States is the only country to have internally restrictive anti-literacy laws. These laws successfully removed all meaningful connection with material knowledge production from the Black community at large for over a century. The effects of these laws are still seen today, as Black Americans represent 23% of the illiterate in the United States, but only 12% of our population. Such laws existed not just because of the idea that an educated slave is a dangerous person, although this sentiment certainly endures. It is that literacy itself threatened the justification for enslavement, that Africans were, quote, less human, permanently illiterate, and dumb, end quote, and then needed the paternalistic protection being forced upon them. So this is how the fledgling nation is officially managing the enslaved population, both linguistically and socially, at least initially. The latter half of this period includes the foundation of the U.S. police force as a nationwide squad of slave catchers. Over the 100 years before the Civil War, The Black people, brave, desperate, and able enough to free themselves, encountered many dangers in the less than accepting North. Oftentimes, advertisements seeking fugitives were printed in newspapers and sometimes even read by clergy from Sunday pulpits to give the public information that could be used to identify these individuals. But before I turn the slide, I want to reinforce that these advertisements illustrate verticalization of the white standard variety, one that is gradually absorbing more spheres of usage like print journalism and religious practice as national institutions are established over the centuries when Blacks are barred from material knowledge production by law. So advertisements like these set up a system of monitors throughout the country to pay attention to Black people's speech, to identify them, to punish them by returning them to a life of forced work and depersonalization. And it is in these conditions that the now centuries-old culture of style shifting in the Black linguistic tradition begins to develop. For Blacks at this time, sounding like yourself could be life-threatening. If we take Fanny at the bottom right here, for example, who is described as speaking both English and French, she might find herself in a situation where she avoids one of her registers in public entirely to stay safe. Today, most Black people aren't beaten to death or imprisoned for using accented or so-called low varieties, but avoiding non-standard registers in public remains a means of preserving Black life. Moving to the modern era, likely one of the most important cases in terms of social justice with respect to U.S. legal precedent is Mendez v. Westminster, which was actually decided on February 18th, 1946. So it is coincidentally celebrating an anniversary. It was immediately appealed. That's why it says 1947. In the simplest terms, a group of parents sued a California school district to have their children, who were of Mexican descent but considered members of the white race, removed from a school for children with special needs, where they had been placed for speaking. The parents were successful. It's a good outcome. But we'll focus on the argument the court makes for allowing integration of these groups, which is that through their segregation, the Mendez children and others like them were being denied exposure to English, and that it is through this commingling of the entire student body, which instills and develops a common cultural attitude among the school children, which is imperative for the perpetuation of American institutions and ideals. The courts are prioritizing this common cultural attitude, and that lets us know that they were aware of language's power for social construction here. They are aware that national ideals, that the belief systems which uphold our markets could be weakened if populations like these remained unintegrated by maintaining their heritage languages. And so the issue facing the courts here isn't really about these children learning. It is about the education system producing adults that can seamlessly assimilate into American institutions. What these shared histories illustrate for us is that language plays a huge role in outlining the various populations in the United States. And arguments for or against certain types of language use are made for a singular purpose, the preservation of a dominant worldview, one which leans towards the preferences of those in social control over time. Intersections between language and identity manifest because linguistic usage is conditioned by the social milieu. Today, our shared social milieu is one which exhibits a standard language ideology or a bias towards an idealized spoken language, which is maintained by dominant bloc institutions and which is drawn primarily from the language of the upper middle class. This bias may be passive or active in individuals, but it creates a scenario where all the social meanings available to a user in a given context have been pre-valued by their proximity to an abstracted standard variety, one used primarily by the middle-aged, the able-bodied, the cis-het, the moneyed, the white, the Christian, and the male across the global north. Because bodies cannot be separated from the production of language or their place in society, people who exist in certain types of bodies never produce language in any form that can be perceived as proper or standard or respectful or complete or complex or clean or clear or civil or good enough. As Cree scholar Sean Wilson observes, relationships do not merely shape reality, they are reality. And knowledge, even of ourselves, emerges through and is dependent upon all of our relationships, including with ideas. Through our socialization, some language users become marked as less than, and our passive acquisition of this allows other individuals and institutions to treat them this way as well. Sounding Black in adulthood, allowing the obviousness of the body you live in to be present in the way you use language, becomes a marker of all these negative connotations like low intelligence and laziness, because the education system should have fixed you, should have given you tools for removing the signs of non-standardness, and in this case, signs of your race from your language use. Once our shared milieu was established, once Black people in the United States were afforded access to the written word by law, any idea they generated must be presented back to society in such a way that it leans towards the preferences of those in social control. Knowledge is power, and the bodies populating our institutions do not want to lose an iota of it. When a minoritized language is being maintained in any modernized society, this represents an active generational effort to sustain and transfer languaging practices. Using African American languages within and across modern linguistic markets incurs a daily psychosocial tax, which Smitherman describes as a linguistic push-pull between one's varieties, identities, and access to domains, which recognizes that almost every time Black embodied individuals use language, they are called to choose between the, again, seemingly binary options of promoting African American cultural stability or achieving personal and professional stability. The extant pressure to verticalize is so intense for these users that the presence of a robustly maintained and distinctly African American variety of English in the present is at least very impressive. Today's African American languages developed from groups of survivors with disparate linguistic systems in their minds, who were first forcibly separated from their speech communities and then thrust into a created social relationship. These individuals somehow found public and playful ways to build a culture of resistance and renewal through their language use. And they did it without writing a single word down on paper, sharing ideas only as far as a voice could carry them, one person at a time. Through the subsequent centuries, these survivors' linguistic systems were under intense and intimate contact with English and other colonial languages across the Americas, verticalizing languages that carried social prestige and were increasing in market value. After the Civil War, these populations mobilized into the largest movement of people recorded on this continent, the Great Migration. This act of collective will results in a period of reanalysis and recombination for African American languages, which lays the foundation for the Black varieties we are most familiar with in the United States today. It is here, though, in this historically informed, embodiment conditioned, yet agentive, dialectic moment of social process, that the individual choices which actuate change occur. And when considering Black American language use, we encounter what I have come to call a third wave variety in the Black accented standard, a variety whose usage represents a wedge shoved between cultural and social stability, whose usage represents a solution, a balm to that linguistic push-pull. The Black accented standard manifests as a variety through the socio-historical conditions placed on African American language users and the direct indexation of the majority of their daily linguistic choices to potent and omnipresent standard language ideologies. This variety, as first described by Orlando Taylor, fun fact, one of the people to coin the term ebonics, exists because of the push-pull between more standardized and verticalized linguistic practices and more community-centric horizontal ones. Taylor describes the variety as one which consists of adopted grammatical structures from standard English combined with the distinct phonology of Black English. And if you're wondering what it sounds like, it's the Allstate guy. For war? Just me? All right. This variety spans the middle distance between so-called slang and standard and is the subject of Weldon's phenomenal 2021 work, which captures the very real and unique linguistic challenges faced by upwardly mobile Black individuals. Weldon reports middle-class educated Black adults are struggling under the demands of many markets where, despite engaging wholeheartedly in talking proper, their labor is amplified compared to others around them. What's important to recognize is that Black language users find no quarter in our built environment, no matter what variety of language they are producing. It is their Blackness which conditions how they are perceived. When producing regional AAL, Black accented standard, or white standardized spoken English. I developed the study I'm going to share with you today to elicit from Black professionals metalinguistic commentary, which can provide a broad sense of the ways in which individuals who carry considerations of sociolinguistic labor actively, consciously, in their daily practice, describe their linguistic repertoires and how they might imagine their style shifting practices as a group. In general, I'm interested in theorizing around the differences between the audiences users imagine and the audiences that exist to better understand ideologies' role in our real-time linguistic choices. The metalinguistic method of sociolinguistic interview, or MMSI, contains 7 sections and, not unlike a Lebavian interview, progresses the interviewee through stages and tasks which are geared towards eliciting different and increasingly richer types of metacommentary. For this first application, I designed a protocol to elicit commentary on 5 key social factors, as well as other aspects of variance individuals could be expected to comment on. I interviewed 17 self-identified Black professionals from Detroit, 7 men and 10 women aged 25 to 83. 5 interviewees worked in the education sector, 3 in the nonprofit sector, and the other 9 came from different professions. Now, in general, the literature on verticalization, which for the most part investigates heritage language use, claims that over time, users always assimilate to the so-called dominant languages in their socioscape. If the heritage language or ethnic style is maintained, it becomes severely constrained by context, reduced to a symbol of identity and indexed to participation in cultural lifeways like marriages, holidays, and other rituals. Although African American languages are distinctly and widely stigmatized, even among the community of Black professionals interviewed here who described it as loud, aggressive, uneducated, ghetto, and mess, we certainly experience African American language use across domains. It has not been reduced to Black cultural lifeways. On the contrary, AAL forms the largest pool of new word formation across world Englishes. It is robust, productive, creative, active, and agentively produced. It would seem that maintaining AAL varieties is, in fact, allowing the Black community to survive and thrive as a distinct and active cultural entity. Now, in the interview section on language varieties, I asked interviewees for their thoughts on the label talking white and what it means to them, and if they use it, who it labels. All 17 interviewees had something to say about it, speaking for 4 minutes on average. That's a lot. The label is given very specific components, which indicates that these users are aware of it as a solidified style or register, that it is recognizable to them even if they don't produce it. Talking white is differentiated from typical Black varieties in terms of pitch, attention paid to speech, and standardization. 2 interviewees describe the style through the questions that its usage invokes. Teifel and Turner discuss the attachments of questions to labels and their value for understanding the label's function with respect to the mediation of socially shared systems of beliefs. Maurice, an 83-year-old retired special ed teacher, notes that the label was most often used when citing class differences while he was growing up. Elite Black people did not talk like people in his neighborhood. They sounded white, and this made the folks from the neighborhood question them. Quote, "You're like us in everything but the way you sound. Are you really the way you sound, or are you Black like me on the inside?" End quote. The elite's voices engendered distrust, according to Maurice, because it was never clear if these individuals were choosing not to sound like the folks who lived in the so-called ghetto. Yolanda, a 46-year-old CEO, spoke at length about the talking white label, stating that, quote, "Talking white was always about the relationship to the master," end quote, linking the origins of all Black language varieties to enslavement. Yolanda indicates that when someone is labeled as talking white, it is really the other person asking, quote, "Are you trying to assimilate? Are you denying us to be in the house with master?" End quote. This meta-commentary from Maurice and Yolanda is valuable because it clues us into long-standing dynamics that play within the Black community with respect to the public performance of racial identity. Teifel and Turner include that American Black people in particular have long denigrated any sort of behavior that seems to indicate positive attitudes towards the dominant outgroup, i.e. whites. Weldon indicates that these sorts of attitudes and behaviors contributed directly to the development of the Black accented standard variety, one which maintains the language user's Blackness while approaching the propriety talking white as a practice was developed to uphold across linguistic markets. Maurice and Yolanda's meta-commentary reveals those sentiments are still present and active. Distrust can be engendered among the Black community when a Black person shifts away from their more racialized styles, which is when the talking white label is most likely to be applied to them. The Black accented standard is a delicate variety, the usage of which creates a real challenge for the Black professional. You got to sound just Black enough to be accepted in the neighborhood, but not white enough to engender distrust. However, your language must obey the rules of white morphous syntax and be standardized enough to pass as proper outside of the Black community. One step in either direction can cause the user to be shut out of one community or another or both. I'll let Sasha, a 37-year-old entrepreneur, tell it.
I've also, and you talk about language. I mean, I have spoken. It's funny because I catch myself even sometimes because we as Black professionals, depending on where you come from. I grew up in the inner city, so I have to code switch a lot, right? I have to go see my cousins in the hood and start talking, and they don't want to call. Otherwise, they call me bougie and this and that, right? So I'm trying to code switch and talk, you know, how I talk when I'm in the city versus come to work and try to be very professional and present and stuff like that. So you slip up from time to time and the little slang slides in. So, but I do think that just trying to at least present yourself in the best light from a language perspective, minimizing on the jargon and the slang and the, and I don't, this is probably not even a wrong word to use necessarily, but it just rubbed me wrong. Like one of my new hires, she used to always say at the end, "Yep, bet." Like at the end, I was like, I don't know, like it's probably nothing wrong with it, but maybe we should just say like, okay, I think we've concluded. I captured these action items, so it's just, I don't, so, and so, you're always trying to like fit wherever you are. So it's like, again, I've mentioned when I go with my family, I'm the bougie one, or I'm talking white, or I'm talking, all of that stuff. And so you kind of tone it down and you tend to use more flamboyant, word choice or whatever. Like to go back to when I was in school, or when I was younger and I was living there, I would use more of that. And then, but what I'm surrounded by on a more regular basis are people in the workplace who came from very different environments than I did, that talk very differently than I do. And so I'll make sure I'm trying to use proper diction in English, and when I'm actually presenting, but it's hard because you go back and forth and you'll slip. So it reminds me of when I used to work I was on this one project where I had a roommate in corporate housing, and the roommate was from Costa Rica, I think. But anyway, she used to talk about how she speaks in Spanish, she dreams in Spanish, and everything feels like she's translated. Like every time she goes to talk, she kind of says it in Spanish first and then translates. But that's kind of how I feel. Is I start with my Black hood, original language first, and then I translate it to the work language. So you just constantly feel on, I guess, in both areas, and you try to choose word choices that will resonate best with the group you're surrounding yourself with.
Sasha is active in the working world and has made talking white part of her life. But she style shifts a lot into her more racialized varieties because she doesn't like being called bougie. She says, quote, "It's hard because you go back and forth and you'll slip," end quote. This tension creates sociolinguistic labor for Sasha, who always keeps both of her styles active, as most bilingual individuals do. Tasha is aware of being monitored in her workplace as well as her home. A so-called slip at work, where using a wider style is expected, is something noticeable and potentially harmful to her image or position. But Sasha is more concerned about slipping in front of her family and not being accepted at home, where the talking white label is most likely to arise. Her meta-commentary reveals the power in a label like talking white, which compels daily acts of sociolinguistic labor, moving between and effortfully maintaining her active varieties across contexts and communities. But producing Black accented standard can create bicultural competence in some users such that these daily acts of style shifting have a more assimilationist result, causing the user to be perceived as having made a willful break with the culture. And the results from another section of the MMSI, the discussion of targeted terms task, demonstrates this. This task involved the oral-only presentation of 10 words or phrases arising from the AAL lexicon listed here, in which interviewees are asked what the words mean, and if they use them, how they do so. The goal of this task is to capture how these individuals demonstrate both divergent and convergent knowledge states, derived from their positionality, embodied or otherwise, ideological stances, and participation in linguistic markets as users of Black varieties, of which there are many. By inviting differently positioned community members to analyze their usage in an open and direct way, we create space for the social meanings of linguistic variables to emerge from the individuals who animate the social categories in which such variables are valued. And this table here maps out the areas in which elicited meta-commentary diverged across this population. For example, with the word lit, all interviewees indicated that this was language of the younger generation, but interviewee meta-commentary diverged in that some individuals additionally stated that they themselves were too old in their mid-40s to use that term in public, although they clearly knew what it meant. Elicited meta-commentary on corny and what had happened was revealed divergent percepts of the racial indexation, or rather ownership of these terms, with a few interviewees stating that people of all races know and use them. Some instances of divergence, however, are not as cut and dried. So let's talk about deadass. Deadass is an AAL interjection for serious, which has long been indexed to New York City African American language varieties. This term was included in the task specifically because of its regional indexation. It is expected that interviewees will know this term and perhaps be aware that it is more New York than Detroit. The arrow here represents time and deregionalization. So on the left, we have the oldest memes exemplifying deadass as specifically a New York City thing. As we move towards SpongeBob and Arthur, we find reference to New York City becoming more diffuse or conceptual. And then the more recent memes feature entirely decontextualized usage of the term. While the majority, 13 out of 17 of interviewees, do provide serious for the meaning and some further meta-commentary describing its use, only 5 of them comment directly on the regional origins of deadass. This outcome fits expectations, but the deadass story continues because 2 interviewees, Alex and Yolanda, parse deadass as dead ass, meaning not at all fun or very much not alive. Like, this is a dead ass party, or that is a dead ass cat. The ass suffix functions as an intensifier for the adjectives it attaches to. Both Alex and Yolanda are in their mid-40s, and ass fixing was quite popular when these women were in their 20s. So given their age, together with the fact that this term is not especially common in Detroit usage, and I only presented it orally, it makes sense that they gave us this meaning. Though to be transparent, I am not seeking any specific parse, and I told interviewees as much. All interviewee responses are useful data. Even the parse from Lillian, who indicated that deadass meant bad in a good way. a response that represents the only one which we could consider incorrect across all 17 interviewees discussing each of these 10 terms. The response is revealing about Lillian's verticalization, her positionality with respect to the wider tapestry of language use in her community. My computer's gonna die. Sorry, everybody. Pause for effect. I was like, why is it screaming at me? That was why. Okay. This response to vertical is, okay. What we observe in Lillian's parse of Deadass may be an artifact of the distance created between her racialized self and her community through the identity bleaching inherent in U.S. higher education experiences. Let's hear from Lillian, a 45-year-old female who at the time of this recording was running for Detroit City Council.
Well, I think most African Americans, especially those who are in corporate America, is what I'll say, are capable of adapting. So I think when you've gotten used to being in a certain arena, so like if I am in corporate America and I develop friends within my job and I spend time with them, the more I spend time with them, the more I am speaking that language. It just becomes your normal. That would be the same way if I was with my family more often. And so I think, unfortunately, what tends to happen in our communities is people start to stereotype you one way or the other. And I can say that, you know, going through, because I've run for city council before. 4 years ago, when I campaigned, there were people in the grassroots community who looked at me, and I guess they didn't like the way that I spoke because it was not a lot of slang. You know, to them, I couldn't identify with people in the city. Everybody in my family, they don't know it, but they would probably say, oh yeah, now that person can identify with us. It's my family members. The only difference is I had different exposure when I went to U of M to get my degree. But deep down inside, I'm still the same person. And so they wanted to stereotype me just because of the way that I speak. I don't feel differently when I'm around my family. I still talk the same way that I talk. I might relax a little bit, but not a whole lot. Not a whole lot.
Lillian is acutely aware that bicultural competence is fundamental to the educated Black experience, but she doesn't possess it. Lillian has been awarded, both by her family and her professional arena, for aligning herself with the larger society and thus with standardized production. But the lifetime it has taken for her to command this variety has also severed her connection with Black meaning-making practices, despite living in the same neighborhoods where that innovation is taking place. Lillian is generally protective of the Blackness in her identity, throughout her interview grouping herself and her experiences and her behaviors, not with age, class, or gender groups, but with Black people. Blackness may be Lillian's primary identity. Using standardized varieties does not remove your race. But because of her upbringing and bleaching education, and despite her proximity to a rich and dynamic Black community, Lillian does not possess the same types of knowledge as her fellow Detroiters. It is not Lillian's age which stifles her familiarity with vernacular terms, but her verticalization, an artifact of the distance created between her racialized self and her community by employing the standard in nearly all domains. What I find to be the most powerful portion of this excerpt, however, is when Lillian states that she might relax a little bit when she's around her family. Despite having lost or dampened her connection to Black linguistic knowledge, and perhaps not possessing a robust enough African-American variety to employ, Lillian still perceives producing a Black accented standard variety as work, still feels the work of moving herself up this linguistic ladder, still censors herself in professional spaces. These two interview excerpts seem to beg the question, what is authentic Black language use? Well, that's a case study all its own, and you'll just have to read the dissertation for that full treatment. But to summarize, meta-commentary on authenticity from these 17 interviewees continually referenced Black cultural products as a touchstone, as evidence that Black linguistic communities were thriving. I found that about 85% of interviewees qualified their discussions of what makes Black language Black, or special, or important, or different, or not broken with examples from music. So I started a playlist of all the songs they referenced, and once the interviews were finished, I sent it around and asked interviewees individually if they wanted to add more songs. It's like 5 hours long now, but super dope, so definitely check it out. More for them than for me. To be honest though, if you want to intellectualize it just a smidge, and I do, that playlist spans about 100 years of knowledge creation, and it is rather wonderful to sit and take in the words, sounds, and signs these individuals have given us over the decades, the ways they've taken in the world and chosen to externalize their thoughts for us, in recognition of how difficult it is to use Black language freely most hours of most days for most Black people. How fragile that right remains for us and how constant our affirmation of those rights must be. These people on this playlist are able to have their voices played and replayed, and that's really quite special. When we begin to consider Black language as a cultural product, we also begin to view Black language users reclaiming domains of usage, maintaining their language despite pressure and incentive to verticalize. Between music, arts and entertainment, and sport, Black language users are among the most successful Americans. Recognition that success and affluence can be achieved by users of all African American varieties supplies an important counter-narrative to those of the grammar teachers or other elders who may convince us that the outsized impact these individuals have on popular culture, on living Englishes worldwide, is not important or effective, and that the only road using racialized language paves for one is to the prison yard. These are the exact narratives being resisted in the music of a band called Death, who is on the playlist and whose first album, written in 1971 from a Detroit garage by three brothers with instruments they found in an alley after work, created an entirely new sound, one that would one day convince a generation of young white teenagers, and not just from the United States, to shave their heads and tattoo their necks as a full rejection of wage slavery and the standardized, commodified, cookie-cutter lives that come with it. Chances are good that some of those same young punk teenagers, though, likely have these appropriative products in their homes now as septuagenarians. Appropriation of Black language thrives in the same market these punk teenagers once resisted, where the inappropriateness of language, separated from the bodies it typically issues from, melts away, and these words miraculously become no longer non-standard but casual, no longer slang but trendy, no longer criminal but profitable. What is particularly revealing across these conversations is that they demonstrate Woolard's claim that linguistic ideology is not a predictable automatic reflex of the social experience in which it is rooted. Interviewee meta-commentary supports the assertion that linguistic ideology must be understood as a relational mechanism, which allows for linguistic variables and varieties to inhabit social meanings in the world. What emerged from this socio-historically informed metalinguistic commentary is a fuller picture of the community pattern of Black professional style shifting, and a wider pattern exemplifying the discursive doing of race. Race is inseparable from the actions of racialized people. We can't take Blackness off our bodies. The community's conceptualizations of produced racialized styles illustrate the distance between the material reality of race and the discursive actualization of a racialized life. This community does not often cite expression of their own racial identity as motivations for the linguistic actions they undertake, even when using the Black accented standard. Rather, the majority of interviewees cite that the presence or absence of white people in a given social space determines whether or not they are going to use AAL features, not the context or the expectations of a given domain, or even their personal motivations in the moment. What happens is white people show up and the words in your mouth start to mean something else. The presence of a white listener creates the conditions for specific social meanings like being ghetto or being aggressive to arise from everyday Black language use and stifles the ability of Black people to engage in more horizontal language use at will. These professionals' meta-commentary demonstrates that individuals possess knowledge about the ways in which the bodies of others toggle the social meanings they have available across linguistic markets. The MMSI offers a regularized means of eliciting meta-commentary, providing a more complete and accurate representation of the community pattern and getting at what Aga called the multiple coordination problem, or our struggle to understand how an individual's partially overlapping perspectives on forms and values can yield regularized interactions in certain contexts. In this context, verticalization begins to explain the patterns which emerge when Black professionals describe the linguistic styles they know, employ, and avoid. And I'm grateful to be able to deepen our understanding of the emergence and maintenance of the Black accent standard by presenting how these Black professionals orient to their own experiences and by seeding such present phenomena in their factual historical context. Thank you very much. And I look forward to yeah.
So we have about 20 minutes to have questions for the speakers.
Thank you so much. So I have a question about white bodies showing up and people reacting to white bodies in terms of language. That's a very strong statement. Yeah. I don't want to give that much power, right, to
Sure.
white bodies.
Yeah.
But I also want to push back a little bit on what we mean by white bodies and whiteness, right? Because I've really been thinking about that. So the first question is, what do you mean by white bodies? Especially when we start thinking about white bodies that are not American, white bodies that are not quite what we perceive as what people might perceive as whiteness, right? So I'm curious about that. And also I want to bring back class into this. So like Black upper class bodies in spaces and what they also can do. And then colorism, so light skin bodies versus dark skin bodies, right? So that's the first thing, like what do we mean by white bodies? And then the second question is this uncomfortableness that I'm sitting in, that bodies can affect Black language and what Black folks do with language so deeply, especially because I'd like to still think about language as agency. People having agency.
Yeah.
Language.
Yeah, great. No, thank you. It is a strong statement. I feel, okay, so that actually comes from one of my interviewees who there is like a case study about him at Salmons. And so if you're interested in looking at it more, he tells this story about how he's like, even among, when I feel like I police my own language in Black spaces. When I'm with other Black people, they think that I'm the loud one or I'm the ghetto one. But they only say that when other people are around. So it's like when we're sitting around just at a table or we're out to dinner, if we're like on the patio and we're just sitting there cutting up, his word's cutting up, right? Everything is fine until they seat another table next to us of a group of white people. And all of a sudden they're like, hey, hey, that's what he says, right? Like, tone it down, you know? And he's like, you were worried about us being seen as ghetto. That is what you're worried about. We were fine 2 seconds ago. And now I'm too loud, right? When we were here by ourselves, it was another thing. There's also a different part of this conversation too that comes from one of my female participants who was talking about, like, in reflecting on this similar thing that what Lillian is saying is like, when I'm around my family, I might relax a little bit. She was saying, when I am around Black people, especially other Black women, I can let my guard down. Which I think maybe we all feel like that, right? Maybe it's not about Blackness, right? Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with race. Maybe it was just about race for these 17 people that I talked to, right? That there has to be a group of people that we feel are most comfortable with, right? Where we can let our guard down or use language in any way we choose or at will, right? Where it feels less laborful. I think that that's part of what's going on here is that like the sense that these individuals have about when using language feels like work and when it doesn't. The whiteness part of it, though, I do think is important to emphasize in all of its complexity. I don't know exactly what whiteness is. I don't know exactly what Blackness is, right? It's none of it is all one thing. But when we're thinking about sociolinguistic labor, that this what feels like work, or where we feel like we are motivated to use our most standard styles, like if I was testifying in court, for example, those domains are controlled by these varieties that have been preferred over time, these varieties that belong to groups that have been in social control over time. And in our history, it has been whiter groups, lighter groups, empowered people, right? And so I feel like that's the whiteness of it all is tied to those socio-historical facts, at least in our US context, when we're talking about, African-American accented standard varieties.
And so if you're not engaged in those kinds of switching, you are engaging in some kind of active resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. And I was interested a little bit of like, I know that we're talking about Blackness, but like a lot of this talk did reflect on like how some of these things are in intersection with each other. And you're talking to people from Detroit that also are known to have Detroit accent, and that can exist in there with relation and without relation, and like in conversation with Blackness. How did any of your interviewees have any ways in which, like, when you were talking to them, they either expected it to be a conversation about Detroitness, or was it all like, were they fully keyed in into like, this is a conversation about Black language and not about regionalizations?
That's a good question. So, when they were recruited, the email said, they knew that they were engaging in a conversation about their professional language use, that I'm interested in the ways in which Black professionals, think about and use language in their careers or throughout their lifespan, right? And when we got started and actually logged in to the Zoom, these people, I told them a little bit about the project of like, I'm looking at people from Detroit because, this is the local community I find myself in. It's what I'm most interested in. But also, I know that every person uses language differently. So this is like the one thing that I'm holding constant is like everyone comes from the same city, but you're all different ages and you all have different professions. So tell me about like where you grew up, like where you went to school and what your, the early section of questions is all like demographic. They're not necessarily specifically about language, but people use lots of language-based examples to describe their educational experiences and other things. When we first get into the beginning of the sections that are about language more specifically, I start with questions about Detroit and Michigan and how can you recognize somebody who's from your city? What do they sound like? Is it different from people who are just sound like they're from Michigan and stuff like that? So really specific questions that I know they're going to have an answer to because, they exist in the body and a time, but they weren't being asked, like to reflect necessarily in the same way on like their own like regionality and experiences. But even though I didn't, directly ask for that, some of these other general questions like brought a lot of comparison of being like, okay, like telling me like Black people don't sound the same everywhere, or they might be like this, or like an an old Black people sound like X, Y, and Z. Like there are several people were like, when you get the wisdom, like they talk to you in a certain way when they're, and so this is like not questions I specifically asked, but patterns that definitely like emerge. Like there's this similar seeding of their their language use in this like bigger tapestry. Yeah. Were you thinking about something specific?
No, it's just like considering that like, there's so much work in Detroit that has been done about linguistics. Like so like how and like some of it has a view on race, but a lot of it doesn't. I know that Walt's work on like the Detroit dialect study that was focusing on a lot of these like Black populations was focusing on like this inner cityness of like Detroit, and like that's how it was always talked about. But how do these Black professionals then orient themselves to inner cityness and like Detroitness as that space seems interesting to me.
Yeah, and I said like self-identified, like part of like the screening process or whatever when I was recruiting folks was saying like, do you identify as someone from Detroit? Do you identify as a Black professional? Then I would love to talk to you, right? So they self-selected, but for the majority of people had been there, most of their lives. I mean, the youngest participant was 25, and he had been living in Detroit for 23 years of his life, and I think that was probably like among the smallest time, right? So yeah, so in some ways they sorted themselves. Even though it wouldn't, maybe only 5 or 6 of them would have fallen under Waltz or like other people's like comparable studies. Yeah, I see a question on Zoom, Sarah.
Hello, Kelly. Amazing talk. I really want to push this idea of agency, especially given your participants. What I would think of as being bilingual. These are people who are cognizant or aware of having command of multiple varieties and knowing that they need to have some shifting between these varieties. And yet earlier in your talk, you were talking about how there feels like there's this binary choice. And I'm assuming that binary choice is you choose one language or the other. You choose the language of your people, or you choose the language that will get you socioeconomic, upward mobility, right? And so my question is really about whether or not your participants were aware of their own agency in choosing what might be a third choice, and how that might be something that is also a part of what it means to be this Black professional group. And I understand that you're working with a limited sample, but I just didn't know if there were any thoughts or conversation around that.
Yeah, great question. I have many thoughts. And thank you for asking this. I think, okay, maybe there's 2 ways that I think about agency here. One of them is like, if we didn't have agency, the Black Accented Standard wouldn't exist, because we would be doing one or the other or moving between our varieties, but we wouldn't have created one that seems to be a compromise in this place of like, I can sound Black, but the forms of my language are what's expected in this other place. Like I personally, as a researcher, don't know enough about other, like heritage languages or dialects like that come out of this verticalization literature to know, like, is there like a third, a Dutch accented variety, that is like neither Dutch nor English? Like probably. I just don't know if it has like that same like longstanding like cultural place or like meaning as the Black Accented Standard does. And so I think like moving into that middle space is, I think, like an exercise in agency. Another way that I think about it though is like, sure, we can choose between any style we want at any moment, but maybe like there could be 1,000 on the table, and the like the events of time, like the what has happened in our past makes it a choice of between 5 varieties. That like I may feel like I'm choosing to use any word or anything all the time, but a lot of this has already been selected for me because I existed now and not then, and not yet to come, right? So I think that's part of why I work so hard to encourage the celebration of linguistic variation. That's so like what we are putting into the pool right now for future users ends up being we have a wider range of things to choose from. And so in some senses, it's like, yeah, well, if the American Revolution had gone differently, we might all be speaking German, or we might all be, like all of that old thing. But there's some truth to that, right? So like the fact that we're even talking about varieties of English, I think is like where I start to look at how our agency is limited, or we do make choices in like the discursive actualization of self, but it is from this like in some ways limited set of choices within this widest scope.
So if I could have a follow-up, I'm sorry if there are other people with questions, but this, as someone who is more in the heritage language bilingualism literature and thinking about attrition and language erasure in some of these communities, I can imagine that that is also an active choice. So a lot of Asian Americans will actually become English monolingual, not because they themselves choose to be English monolingual, because that was a choice that was put onto them by their parents. And so when we think about this kind of transgenerational way of, pushing Black excellence, my thought process would actually be to actually make Black kids speak more like white kids and not push a bilingual agenda, given what we see in Asian American communities. And so I think I think there is something interesting here in that in some ways people would expect that for you to have agency to go up vertically, you would need to necessarily conform completely into this linguistic monolingual ideal. And in the Asian American community, I think there is now some like resistance to that, and people are starting to come around and go like, I wish I actually spoke my mother language. And so you see some of this resurgence of that, but it's very different from what it sounds like is happening with Black people, where we are like, no, we need to necessarily be bilingual to be effective and sufficient. And I don't know if there are any factors or things other than maybe especially from a socio-historical perspective, that might give us some insight as to why that might be, given the fact that Asian Americans also had a very difficult and different type of settlement in the United States.
Yeah, this is part of why I'm kind of, like I'm grateful for this space where they're like, come talk about whatever you want. I'll be like, I have an idea. I don't really know if it's real, but I would love to come talk about it. And so thank you for that. But it's part of this of like, whatever is happening in the Black community is not exactly the same that has happened in other communities, which have, this simultaneous like development and trajectory here in the United States. Like, lots of these, if we want to call them like non-white groups, have been here for the same amounts of time, right? So also, yeah, like thinking about that Susan Gall study, like the Overbart, like people are choosing to use German. They're straight choosing to do it. They're saying like, this is better and we're going to become monolingual now. And I think that one thing, and this maybe doesn't actually like answer your question, but it is something like, a lot of these interviewees, we're sitting and we're talking about their language variety. I'm asking them questions about these vocabulary items and they're telling me this means this, bet, finna, blah, 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 right? Back and forth. And then they're like, I don't use Ave. I do not use it. It is not a language that I know or possess, or it's not a language at all. They're calling it things like mess and saying like, I don't talk that mess, or I don't sound ghetto. I never X. And I'm like, I hear you. Like you are producing this variety, but a lot of Black people feel like they have this like languagelessness ideology around it, that it is not real, that it's not something that has a pronounced history in the same way that something like Hungarian or German or Dutch or Cantonese, right? Like could an African American some of these people even say like, who were raised in a standard speaking household, like, could they even say, I wish I had learned X? Like, like, is the X as conceivable to this group of users as it is to others? And maybe that's every community, right? Like, because languages list is certainly not a Black American phenomenon, right? But I think that there's something in the ideology of even conceiving of their varieties as possessible that, you know, influences that those choices in the moment, or choices over generations of saying, like, we have to move in this direction. Maybe they didn't know that, you know, up was not the only way to go. Right? Yeah.
We should definitely chat more.
Yes.
I got a question about methodology. So
Oh, yeah.
the accepted wisdom about social linguistic interviews is that asking questions about language and metalinguistic commentary gets a more careful style. And so I wondered if you thought, you know, designing a lot of your interview around that, if you thought you were pushing your people, your respondents, in a more careful direction, and a more vertical direction, or talking wider.
That's a good question. So, okay, I am light skinned. That's pretty obvious. I think, so in the very beginning of every interview, I just like gave a positionality statement to each of my interviewees in a way to be like, this is who I am, like, this is who you're talking to, this is why I'm doing it. I am interested in what you are saying, but I'm not going to be analyzing your words. I'm not looking for a real, there's no right answer. The right answer is what you think, right? And so I don't know how much that like helped or hurt as far as their, you know, like the white coat syndrome of it all. They were long interviews around between 90 minutes and 2 hours for most of them. That first chunk of questions for probably half, you know, which is just demographic questions, like, tell me where you went to school, like, you know, what was it like growing up in Detroit? We're like, oh, you know, it was cool. I went to this high school, you know, like, that's like it, like, very short. And then when we get farther in, you know, certain questions, different people like really came to life, right? So it's like, maybe overall, I don't think that I ever got really anyone's natural conversational style completely. I don't think anyone was relaxed or producing the vernacular in the way that we maybe like think about it in traditional interviews. But there were certain questions where everyone had like a whole lot to say, and we're very animated about that. One was the question about the N-word. So, like I said, like people talked for like several minutes, like about like on average about like talking white, but in the that discussion of targeted terms task, it'd be like, oh, finna means like I'm getting ready to do this or whatever, like really short. And then when we get to the N-word, it's like 10 minutes. People are telling me their whole life story all over again, you know, really specific narratives, you know, this, that, and the other. And that, you know, those kinds of things, where we would run into something that was really, really personal, I think is where we get like the closest to that like unvarnished response, or at least like a serious, really animated, less casual or less guarded response rather. There were a couple other questions that fell into that category too, where it was like, oh, I'm getting like so much more from just in general, like more words, right, are coming out for some of these questions for the whole population. So yeah, and it was like in a lot, you know, a first iteration.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's take our speaker.
Right at time.
And then everyone's welcome to join us upstairs for the reception on the second floor.
Oh, and then someone could stop recording.
Oh yeah.